Before we start, I'd just like to give a shout out to the following people for supporting Stories Telling Stories on Patreon: Jim Ross, Holly, and Tamara. Thank you so much for your support. If you'd like to help support the show and hear your name listed before future episodes, head on over to patreon.com/storiestellingstories. Welcome to week 7 of Locked in a Vacancy. My name is Eric, and I am here as your host once again, as I always am, because we are still locked down at home, and I don't really have access to other voices other than my own. At least that fit my schedule and whatnot. Anyway, week 7. 7 straight weeks of doing this sub-series of the original Stories Telling Stories podcast, which we will get back to. This is sort of the focus right now, just because it's very now in regards to when we're all going to get out of this. Although I may spice it up in a few weeks with another episode of the main series. We'll see. We'll see how I'm feeling. But right now, I'm still just locked into these stories of isolation and loneliness, and really it's kind of fascinating to see how story after story it's the same thing that we're seeing in the world in those instances where we actually look at the news and see this pure visceral form of human behavior. At least among Americans, it's ridiculous. In so many other countries around the world, they're following a stricter lockdown, and we aren't. But we are the ones, the collective we, are the ones stamping our feet and demanding satisfaction. I don't know, maybe that has something to do with the profoundly surreal level of fierce cradle to the grave libertarianism that a lot of the people in this country have. I don't know. Something that was brought to my attention this morning was about an ice cream shop in Massachusetts that closed after opening for one day because of how the customers were treating the employees. Specifically, a 17-year-old girl who had worked there for 3 years. Like, people were not following the rules. They were driving up instead of calling ahead. They were getting out of their cars, everything that they weren't supposed to be doing, and they were taking all of their anger and frustration out in profanity-laced outbursts towards this 17-year-old girl. Maybe she was an easy target, I don't know. But she worked her one-day shift and went to her boss, and she quit. Like, the only reason she was there is she was trying to save money for college. She had done for the last few years, and she couldn't handle it. She couldn't handle the way people were acting, and I don't blame her. I do not blame her. But the silver lining to this situation is the owner of the store did set up an online fundraiser to help get that poor girl money for college, and we got to remember that there's more goodness out there than negativity, because people came through it's really heartwarming. They raised over $30,000 for this girl for her college fund. And I'm not saying that makes up for the behavior that was levied her way by these people. I don't know what else to call them, but it does give at least a little bit of a feeling of redemption, and the good does outweigh the bad, and it's unfortunate that in our media and in our lives, it's those negative people, it's the trolls, it's the assholes, it's the negative things that bubble to the surface, and those are the things we remember. You could have 100 people and 99 of them are totally pleasant. You have one person who's a real piece of work, and you go home at the end of the workday just remembering that one person and not the 99 that were pleasant. It's an interesting look into humanity and how we're acting, especially right now when we're feeling so locked in cages. Because when you lock a human in a cage, you're going to lash out. And that segues into our story this week, which is The Escape by J.B. Stamper, a Scholastic children's book that is apparently surprisingly popular. It's one I never read as a kid, so I'm looking forward to reading it now. It's about an inmate who escapes from solitary confinement. Let's dive into it right now. This is The Escape on Locked in a Vacancy. Boris looked down the long, dark hallway of the prison. It looked endless. He was being taken to a place that few people had seen, but everyone feared it. Solitary. The other prisoners said the word with a shudder. Behind him, the guard laughed. "Well, this'll teach you a lesson," he said. "Once you've been in solitary, there'll be no more bad behavior from you." Boris forced his feet to move down the hall. He knew there was no hope for him. 7 years ago, he had committed a crime. It was a crime so terrible that even he could not believe that he had done it. Now, he was in prison for the rest of his life. He was trapped like an animal in a cage. He could not face it any longer. That's why he had tried to escape. It had been just after sunset. He was all alone in the courtyard. The guard who was supposed to be there had made a mistake. He had left Boris alone. Boris had run for the wall like an animal. He had climbed up and was almost over. Then he had heard the words, "Freeze, prisoner!" And he had frozen. That was just yesterday. Now, he was headed to an even worse cage. "You don't have to put me in solitary," Boris said to the guard in a scared voice. "I'll never try that again. I promise." The guard just laughed. "You'll learn your lesson," he said again. "Maybe they'll let you out after a few months, but you're a tough one. I know what you did to get inside. You don't deserve anybody's pity." Boris felt hopeless. It was no good trying. He would just have to deal with it, somehow. They were coming to the end of the hallway. Boris saw the door at the end. He saw the bars across the small window in the door. He knew that this was it. The others had told him what it would be like inside. They were right. The guard unlocked 3 locks. Then he swung open the door. He pushed Boris inside. The room was like a pen. It was long and narrow with one bed. Hung up there was a small window with bars across it. The walls were of old, rough stone. To Boris, it felt as if they were closing in on him. His breath started to come in short gasps. His heart pounded. Boris turned to the guard. "No," he begged. "I can't take it here. Let me go back to where I was. I'll never do anything wrong again." "You should have thought of that earlier," the guard said. Then he slammed the heavy door in Boris's face. Boris reached for the door. He grabbed the bars in his hands and tried to shake them. "You'll be sorry!" he yelled after the guard. The guard just looked back and laughed. Boris sat down on the bed. He shut his eyes. He didn't want to look around the cell. He was afraid that he would lose his mind. Thunder woke Boris from a terrible nightmare. In the meantime, rats were running at him, screeching. He opened his eyes. He was afraid the rats were really there. He hated rats more than anything. It was his biggest worry, that there might be rats in solitary. Boris looked around the cell. It was almost dark. Then a flash of lightning lit up the cell. The light fell on the wall at the head of his bed. Boris saw something that made his heart leap. One of the stones in the wall looked different. There was a thin crack in the cement around it. Boris tried to fight off a new feeling of hope, but he couldn't help himself. Maybe another prisoner had dug around the rock. No one could see the crack unless they were lying on the bed. He had only seen it because of the lightning. His hands were shaking. He reached down and grabbed the large stone. He moved it back and forth. Then, suddenly, it came loose. Boris pulled and the rock fell forward into his hands. As Boris stared into the hole left by the rock, a flash of lightning lit it up. A tunnel stretched before him, with a rat hurrying down into it. Boris jumped back in horror when he saw the rat. He thought about putting the large stone back in the place. Then another flash of lightning cut through the darkness of the cell. The tunnel lit up in front of him. It seemed to welcome him to freedom. Boris measured the size of the tunnel with his eyes. It was narrow at the beginning, but then it became wider. It looked wide enough for him to crawl through. Another flash of lightning lit up the tunnel. He searched for any sign of the rat. "Maybe I didn't see it at all," Boris whispered to himself. "Maybe it was just a shadow of my nightmare." Boris peered into the tunnel. He saw no sign of the rat, but his eyes fell on something else. There was a scrap piece of paper lying on the tunnel floor near the entrance. He reached in and pulled it out. He felt its dry surface. The paper was wrinkled with age. He waited impatiently for the lightning to light up the cell again. When it did, he quickly read the message to the paper. "To the next prisoner who finds this paper," Boris read. "I escaped the horror of this cell by this passage. May you share my good luck." The light faded away before Boris could finish reading the message. He sat in the darkness, shaking with fear and hope. The message seemed to be written in a dark red liquid. He guessed that it was the blood of the person who had written it. At last, the lightning came again. He read on. "This is the only way out." The message was signed with 2 initials. N.G. Just then, Boris heard the guard's footsteps outside his cell. He threw himself over the stone and hole. He pressed his body against the wall. He waited as the footsteps came to a stop outside his cell. He thought he would scream from the horrible tension. Then the footsteps moved away, then slowly drifted down the hallway. Finally, the noise faded into the night. Suddenly, Boris knew he could not wait any longer. He stuck his head into the tunnel and pushed the rest of his body through. He tried to look back, but the tunnel was too narrow. There was no turning back now. Boris squirmed deeper and deeper into the tunnel, crawling on his stomach. He felt like a snake slithering into its hole. He felt the tunnel grow damper and colder. Just as the tunnel began to grow slimy, it opened up and became wider. Boris stood up on his trembling legs. He could see into the darkness ahead. He put his hands out in front of him and walked slowly through the black tunnel. The rocky walls were sharp and tore at his hands. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with one hand and felt warm blood oozing from it. Boris felt sick. His legs became weak with fear. He dropped to his knees and fell forward onto his hands. Then he felt tiny, clawed feet run over his fingers. Boris heard his own scream echo and echo through the tunnel. Once again, the tiny claws of a rat dug into his hands. Boris climbed to his feet, hitting his head on the low ceiling of the tunnel. Then he felt them, all around. The rats were running over his feet. They were crawling at his legs. Boris opened his mouth to scream, but he knew he had to be quiet. He dug a fist into his mouth. He made himself move forward into the tunnel. All he could hope was that the rats would not climb up his leg. If they did, he knew he would lose his mind. Suddenly, the tunnel sloped down at a sharp angle. Boris's feet slipped forward. He landed on his back. He slid deeper and deeper into the tunnel. He no longer felt the rats around him. He no longer heard their claws scratching the rock. Boris came to a stop where the floor of the tunnel suddenly became flat. His breath was coming in short gasps that tore at his lungs. He picked himself up. He reached for the slimy walls of the tunnel that he had just fallen down. Then the truth hit him like a blow. He could never go back. The walls of the tunnel behind him were too steep and slippery. He had only one chance. He had to push on. He had to push on and hope that there was an end to the tunnel. Boris moved himself forward. He clawed at the walls with his hands, trying to hurry. The tunnel was beginning to feel more and more narrow. His breath was coming in shorter and shorter gasps. Then the tunnel made a sharp turn to the left. Suddenly, Boris saw something that made him cry out in relief. Through an opening in the distance, he could see the pale rays of the moon. He was almost there. He could smell the night air. Boris struggled towards the patch of moonlight ahead of him. The tunnel was turning upward. Boris had to grab both sides of the wall and dig his feet into the cracks in the wall. Slowly, he pulled himself up. Boris felt the blood from his cuts run down into his sleeves, but the pain didn't matter. All that mattered was the patch of light ahead. Boris felt the night air against his face. He was close now, close to freedom. Then the sound behind him terrified him. It was the sound of those clawed feet. They were following him. Boris scrambled up to the top of the tunnel even faster. The moon was so bright now that he could see his hands in front of him. He felt a rat brush against his leg, but he had only a few yards to go. With his last bit of strength, Boris lunged towards the light. He felt his head crash into something hard and cold. For a moment, he was stunned. Then he opened his eyes. In front of him, the moon shone through the bars of a heavy gate. Still pressed up against it were the cold, white bones of a skeleton. There was no escape. There was no going back. This was it. Just Boris and the rats. The end. Locked in a Vacancy is produced in collaboration with Stories Telling Stories and STS Media Group, socially isolating itself at Milt House Studios in Milton, Vermont, casting around the globe to your frontal lobe wherever podcasts are found. Locked in a Vacancy is also streaming on YouTube at Stories Telling Stories. Make sure to give us a review wherever you stream our show. We really appreciate it. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, give us a subscribe on YouTube, and consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And until next time, stay sane, stay safe, and stay whimsical.